Yes, well, there are two separate answers to that question. One resource is physical in terms of oil and gas and minerals, and the other might be considered the sea routes, which also could be thought of as a resource, a transportation resource. So it seems that the U.S. Geological Survey just published a report that estimates that 22% of the world's undiscovered but technically recoverable oil and gas resources are found in the Arctic, much of that offshore, and of that, most of it's natural gas. And so previously, the ice blocked much of its exploration, but as the hard multi-year ice melts away, it's becoming more accessible. And of course, as the price of oil remains expensive, it becomes more economically feasible to access those resources as well. The second resource you mentioned are the sea routes. On the North American side, the Northwest Passage. On the Eurasian side or Russian side, the Northeast Passage, it's also called the Northern Sea Route, might also be thought of as resources, and those are transportation shortcuts much shorter in distance between North Atlantic and the North Pacific than having to go through the Panama or Suez canals, or for the biggest ships in the world, like very large crude carriers that don't fit through the canals, have to circumnavigate Africa and South America, it's much shorter to go just over the top. The region is so important because it is at the epicenter of the Northern Hemisphere. It is central to, might be a future entrepot, a Mediterranean of sorts, to the North America and to Eurasia. So it has gone throughout periods of importance throughout history, being very important, not important. For example, in the Cold War, much of the intercontinental ballistic missiles would have actually flown over the Arctic. NORAD is there, for example. Our nuclear submarine patrols were there. But in the 90s, at the end of the Cold War, it seemed unimportant. So the Arctic again is becoming central as the ice recedes, opens up these oil and gas resources, and the potential for shipping shortcuts as well. Russia is the best position. It's the best position for two reasons. One, just sheer geography. It has the longest Arctic coastline, deep, long Arctic rivers, and it just happens to have the best geography as it relates to Arctic. It's also its best position in terms of infrastructure and resources. Ships already built, icebreakers, and even a worldview of focus that points towards the Arctic. I think characterizing the United States as playing catch-up might be a little too generous to the United States in that we've not signed the law of the sea, we have not built icebreakers, we have little to no infrastructure on the Arctic coast, and just this summer, for the first time, the U.S. Coast Guard is beginning to explore what it means to have a presence up there. So we are far behind in relates to the Arctic in establishing an Arctic sovereignty presence compared to the Russians. The UN Convention on the Law of the Sea governs much more than just the Arctic. It's a UN treaty written in part by the United States, as well as all the UN countries, that governs all of the resources of the sea. It established rules for the ocean's use, for where ships might go, the rights and responsibilities of coastal states, and so forth. And so those rules can be applied and are applied to the Arctic, but to enjoy some of the privileges of that treaty, a country has to sign it and be part of it. The United States so far has not, because of debate in the Senate that doing so might give up some U.S. sovereignty, even though by signing the treaty we'll get much more continental shelf in the Arctic Ocean and rights as a coastal state to police shipping transiting through our Arctic waters. Well, I think armed conflict might be a stretch. It's not out of the realm of the imagination, but it's definitely at the far extreme of what could happen. So I think it likely will not be armed conflict. I think what could happen, though, is if Arctic states don't do the hard spade work now of the diplomacy, of the international institutions, that the Arctic could be a place where it increases state rivalry and state competition that has spillover effects elsewhere. So like the recent Russian invasion of Georgia and the tensions over South Ossetia, that might have a bleed-over effect from the Arctic if tensions increase there. Same with the U.S. and Canada, our largest trading partner. People don't realize that, but the United States and Canada actually make things together, but we have deep differences over the Arctic that should be resolved now so as not to interfere with our trading relationship. I would characterize really three main areas in which the law of the sea applies to the Arctic. The first is in terms of extending a coastal state's continental shelf. Under the treaty, coastal states automatically get 200 nautical miles out from their shore of the resources of the shelf and in the water column above it. But if a country can prove that its continental shelf extends actually past that, per the provisions of the treaty, then it can claim that additional territory and then the resources with that as well. Russia, planting its flag at the North Pole last summer, was ostensibly part of that effort in terms of gathering evidence from its continental shelf to show that it is an extension of this thing called the Lomonosov Ridge. And so the treaty governs that and creates an institution called the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf that oversees the technical submissions by countries to grant the additional shelf. And so given the vast resources up there, that has obvious huge implications. But that process is going on elsewhere in the world, not just in the Arctic. And in fact, Australia just received a huge amount of additional continental shelf per that process. The second area of relevance per the law of the sea is the definition of internal waters versus international strait. Some waters are internal to a country, like the Chesapeake Bay, no one would argue is definitely part of the United States. But in Canada, its Arctic archipelago, there's a debate about whether or not the passage, the Northwest Passage through that, is actually an international strait, like through the Strait of Gibraltar or the Strait of Hormuz or Malacca, where all ships have a right of freedom of transit through there, or if indeed it's Canadian internal waters, like maybe the Chesapeake Bay would be for the United States. So the U.S. wouldn't like it so much if Canadian ships or Russian ships were sailing through the Chesapeake Bay without permission. Canada doesn't either, but the U.S. claims that it's an international strait, and so the laws of the sea and how it governs Arctic passages, same is true on the Russian side, is important. Lastly is the fact that even though the sea ice is melting, there will always be, in wintertime, sea ice in the Arctic. And when you have ice in an ocean and you add ships to it, it is a bit more complicated than sailing through, say, the Caribbean, which is nice and warm and beautiful. And so there's a provision of the treaty, although very short, that gives Arctic states extra power to govern for safety purposes ships that transit through ice-covered waters. And because there haven't historically been many ships transiting through the Arctic, it's not entirely clear how this provision might be applied, but it's one that at least Canada and possibly the United States and other Arctic countries will look to assert more aggressively and actively in the future so as to try and prevent an environmental disaster on their Arctic shores. So China historically has not been that interested in the Arctic just as a function of its geography. But of course, China is a country that is desperately in need of resources to continue to fuel its economic boom. And the Arctic looks to be a vast storehouse of resources. So China is increasingly becoming interested in the Arctic, but because it lacks an Arctic coastline, it's somewhat limited on the influence that it's able to have there. China also is interested, interestingly, in climate change research in the Arctic and has an icebreaker named the Snow Dragon that occasionally goes to the Arctic to conduct research. And China is joined by other states that don't have Arctic coastlines that are expressing an interest in this region because of its growing importance. And others, the European Union, for example, is increasingly becoming interested, as is NATO, because of the security implications of a melting Arctic and wanting to be more active in the discussions of how the diplomacy might unfold. And Japan is also especially interested, given its geography, for two reasons. One, almost all of Japan's oil and gas imports must transit through the Malacca Straits, which is a huge issue for security and just in terms of lack of diversity in its energy resources. And so the Arctic offers potentially a lot of diversification and energy security for Japan. And also because since Japan is so far north in the Pacific, it actually presents a great shortcut to go through the Northern Sea Route, or perhaps right over the North Pole one day to North America, to the North Atlantic, or to northwestern Europe, than it would be having to transit through the Suez Canal. So Japan especially stands to benefit from active Arctic shipping. I think that there's little clandestine activity happening in the Arctic, but the truth is we don't really know because the United States and Canada aren't really sure what ships are transiting there now. But I think it's a bit of a stretch to say that Al-Qaeda or international terrorism or other transnational crimes such as drugs or human trafficking will go through the Arctic because it's such a long, arduous, still cold place. Canada, I think, uses that issue because they think that's what Americans care about. So when there are discussions about getting the United States more interested in the Arctic, Canada often raises that issue because it's one they think will play in Washington, D.C., when I think really maybe it's not that relevant when it comes to international security threats transiting through those waters.